Hi, I'm Tom Field, Senior Vice President of Editorial with Information Security Media Group. Welcome to today's session, entitled Revealing the Dark Web, How to Leverage Technologies to Alert and Block Dark Web Access. Your presenter today is Patrick Knight. He's Senior Director of Cyber Strategy and Product Management with Veriato. Now, before I turn this over to Patrick, let me give you just a bit of background on today's session. We've all seen what's possible with the dark web thanks to Silk Road. If you're interested in buying or selling someone's private data like social security numbers or credit card information, it's disturbingly easy to do so. All you need is a computer, a Tor browser, and cryptocurrency, and it's all completely anonymous. So how do companies arm themselves with the right tools to protect themselves against rogue access to the dark web? In this session today, you're going to learn more about the dark web, how leading organizations leverage technology to combat cybercrime and fraud through the dark web, and what companies can do to eliminate these threats. I want to take just a minute before we start to tell you about my organization, Information Security Media Group. We currently publish more than 24 international media sites. We have Bank Info Security and CU Info Security for financial services, Gov Info Security for the public sector, and Healthcare Info Security for the medical community. We also publish Info Risk Today, Data Breach Today, and Careers Info Security. Each of these sites is dedicated to provide education and news regarding information security, but specifically tailored to their individual sectors. With over 750,000 members registered to our sites, we've created a true information source that tackles the key issues of interest to our unique audience. Just a few notes of housekeeping. If you have any questions for Patrick during the course of this session, you can submit them anytime via the chat window that you see on your screen. If any of you should experience any technical issues while viewing today's webinar, please dial the number you see on your screen now. If you dial extension 134, we do have technical support staff standing by to help. Also, I need to emphasize, the content being presented in today's webinar is copyrighted material. As such, it's meant for today's session and individual study purposes only. If you or your organization would like to use any of the information presented in today's session, or if you're looking for customized training materials, please contact us. A bit about our sponsor today, Veriato. Veriato develops AI-driven insider threat protection solutions that provide companies with visibility into and an understanding of the human behaviors and activities occurring within their networks. Thousands of companies in more than 100 countries use Veriato's award-winning software to protect their most valuable data, monitor for risks from insiders, maximize productivity, and gain unparalleled visibility into their operations. To learn more, please visit www.veriato.com. It's my pleasure now to introduce our speaker, Patrick Knight. Again, he's the Senior Director of Cyber Strategy and Product Management at Veriato, an innovator in actionable user behavior analytics, and a global leader in insider threat protection. Veri helps organizations protect critical data from threats by trusted insiders. For more than 17 years, his cybersecurity career has helped enterprises protect against online threats through the development of anti-malware, network intrusion detection, computer and network forensics, and encryption technologies. He's a writer and speaker on topics of cybersecurity in multiple forums. He served in the U.S. intelligence community and the U.S. Army for 12 years. With that, let me turn this over now to Patrick Knight. Patrick, it's all yours.
Thank you, Tom, for having me. I appreciate this opportunity. I think it's a great topic, and it's one that I think a lot of individuals might have heard of, but may not actually fully understand why this is important, particularly in an enterprise. So with that, I want to jump in and talk about the dark web threats to the enterprise and what enterprises need to be aware of and how they can look for and handle this threat to their enterprise. But let's set the stage for what we're talking about, because again, I think a lot of people have heard about what heard about the dark web, but they may not really understand what it means. When we talk about the World Wide Web, most people think about what they can access through their browser. So to put this into context, anything that you can see with that ease that is indexed by search engines like Google and Bing, or things you can browse to without any additional access, we refer to that typically as the surface web. Some may call it the clear web. And as big as that may seem, there's actually a lot more content to the internet than that alone. There's more content that if you need to log in to see it, or it's paywalled, for example, through online media, online newspapers, for example, then we're getting into another part of the internet that we often refer to as the deep web. It's not illicit necessarily. It is just simply stuff that you shouldn't be able to access without a password or some other blockade. Some people access their work networks from home through special privileges, so that would probably constitute as well the deep web. And you can think of a lot of examples where there's content that you can access that a Google or a Bing probably couldn't get to. But even below that, now there are new technologies that give a layer of encryption and anonymity that even those search engines can't access. And now we're talking about areas of the internet that we call the dark web. They're dark because you can't Google terms that have been indexed from these sites. Why? Because you need special technology to access them, even through your browser. And we're talking about technologies like the Tor network. There are also others, even though the Tor network is probably the most popular and most well-known. But there are other technologies that constitute the dark web too. And these are, again, just technologies that allow layers of encryption and anonymity that prevent search engines from being able to crawl there. Other examples are I2P, which is a different kind of protocol, and Freenet is a type of peer-to-peer network that is encrypted. And these don't necessarily talk to each other, but they certainly are off limits to being seen by just normal browsers. You need a special kind of a plugin or special technology just to access them. But what can you get on the dark web that you can't get anywhere else? Well, anonymity is number one, because really crime goes on all layers of the internet. So because the dark web also has this stigma to it, this sort of mystique that's where the bad guys operate, that's largely true because that layer of anonymity and encryption gives them the ability to hide even better than they probably could on these other areas of the internet. But that's not to say that there's only criminals in the dark web that don't exist in these other areas. And that's not to say also that there aren't legitimate uses for the dark web that it's not necessarily a bad thing to be using. For example, if you're living in a very oppressed region of the world, perhaps you rely on this for survival, so that you can actually communicate with the outside world, perhaps communicate about what's going on, and to do so on the open net might actually get you landed in jail or worse. So I don't want this discussion to sound like everything that goes on in the dark web is necessarily bad, but I think most of us would agree that in the enterprise, if you don't have legitimate reasons for employees to be accessing the dark web, then I think your first instinct is probably correct, that something here is probably not right, especially if you have critical data that you want to protect, that you don't want leaked anywhere, much less through the dark web, where it's even more difficult to trace. So how big is this dark web? Well, remember the three areas of the internet we talked about. The surface web is about 5% by some measures of the entire World Wide Web. That deep web part, which is more content that you simply have to log into or go through a paywall or go through some other sort of controlled access to get to, is estimated at anywhere from 500 to 5,000 times even larger than the surface web. The dark web, well, we don't know exactly. There are some estimates people try to measure, but because it's not indexable through engines like Google and Bing and so forth, then it's really hard to measure. Now, just this week, I had a discussion with a company whose job it is to actually try to index as much as they can of the dark web, and they provide this as an enterprise service so that you can actually see if any of your data has been leaked on the dark web. And they were very truthful and open with me about the size of the dark web, that they can't measure it simply because those reasons that I've already stated. It's not indexed. There's not an automated method currently available That's not to say that one won't be developed one day, but because the rules of internet working are slightly different in these dark web technologies, they can't measure it. But they have actually calculated that there are hundreds of thousands of known websites operating on the dark web that they know about and then they index. So that's an interesting example. And if you think of hundreds of thousands of websites, and we're going to get into some examples of what these look like in just a moment, that's a lot of areas where criminals might be operating. We're not talking about a Facebook or a Google or any sort of common web-based application that you typically find on the dark web. Typically, we're going to see a lot of markets and a lot of places where illegal, illicit materials are traded and sold. So how do people get on the dark web? Well, if you are starting from the surface web and have never done this, you probably don't even know how. There is, again, no Google that's going to help you navigate on the dark web. But if you use a tool that is freely available, like the Tor browser, for example, this is really just a modified version of Firefox that has a bundled Tor proxy, which is just a little application that tunnels your traffic onto that Tor network. Then you can start accessing Tor websites. And Tor websites are different from regular websites which typically end in .gov or .net or .com. These all end in a .onion high-level domain, and that's because they're using a technology called onion routing, which is, again, slightly different. It's multiple layers of encryption that are added onto the protocols to protect and to hide this traffic from viewing eyes, typically from law enforcement. But once you're on, there are websites that give you some quick links to where you might want to go. This is just one snapshot. Again, this is on the dark web, and I've tried to mask out the actual locations throughout this presentation because I'm not looking to arm people with illicit materials. I'm simply trying to educate. But this is just a wiki that had some quick links to some services that you might want to access on the dark web. And in this case, we're in the financial services section of this particular website. These are a lot of links you can go to use cryptocurrencies. And again, as Tom mentioned earlier, you add cryptocurrency, which is an anonymous form of online financial transaction, with purchasing something that you want to be anonymous, and now you've got the perfect storm for bad stuff to be bought and sold on the dark web. So from a site like this, you might then find yourself going to some of the other sites that we've been referring to. And here's some examples of the kinds of materials that people can access on the dark web, again, from prying eyes because of the encryption and the anonymity that the dark web provides. So this particular website is offering counterfeiting identification services. So you can presumably purchase using Bitcoin fake IDs. And the screenshot here shows a variety of IDs, driver's licenses, passports, and you can imagine what could possibly be wrong here if someone were trying to access something like this. What are they going to do with fake IDs or fake credit cards? Buying drugs, probably one of the most notorious aspects of what goes on the dark web is people buying illegal drugs. And this particular website, it claims to provide some very serious narcotics here. And we're not talking about simple marijuana or cannabis here. We're talking about some serious stuff that even criminals have figured out how to capitalize on these technologies to further their businesses. And this has really turned into an enormous business for any type of criminal activity. Continuing on, even more serious weapons. And as hard as this may sound, or hard as this may be to believe, this is a big business and a very scary one at that. To the notion of being able to purchase weapons anonymously using anonymous currency. So again, a lot of examples here of things that that if it was hidden from law enforcement, hidden from prying eyes, you can only imagine how bad this could be for individuals and enterprises. Now we're getting more into the technology because I'm trying to narrow this down into probably some things that are more relevant to this audience. Why would an enterprise care about the dark web? Well, maybe my employees aren't buying weapons at work, but they could be hiring online attackers to strike back at their employer or possibly to strike at a competitor. Look at this. You can hire phishing email scams. You can hire denial of service attacks. You can hire people to hack accounts and so forth. And this is a common commodity. You know, hackers for hire sounds like a very clever marketing campaign for this particular website, but this is a very real thing and a very real threat to the, and speaks to the capabilities of what can be found on this on the dark web. What's more, whistleblowing. So now we're getting into the possibility of data leaking and being published publicly. There are plenty of websites where not only can whistleblowers post information about their employer, but also leak sensitive data. And to that point, even more prominent today, and probably one of the biggest growing areas of the dark web, is the ability to buy and sell stolen credit information, financial information, healthcare information, and this is a commodity. And the reason I want people to visualize this and see this is that there's a value to criminals over stolen financial information, stolen personal information, anything that someone can purchase through one of these anonymous markets to use for furthering their spam network attacks, or using that information to hack accounts or to open fraudulent bank accounts, for example. This is a real thing, and it's growing, and it's a huge concern for many organizations, and it should be. Again, what you're seeing here is just items that people have, individuals have posted that they've probably stolen or that they are requesting. So personal information, social security numbers, date of birth, etc. This is a collection of data that's presumably been stolen, probably through a hack, and now they want to sell it. Or maybe they want to buy this kind of stuff, and then someone comes on who's hacked a site and has this information available, and they say, okay, for this price, I'll sell you 10,000 accounts that I've stolen, and then the criminals take it from there and then use that for whatever purposes they want to use it for. So a lot of examples here of the type of activities that go on the dark web. And I think anyone who's probably before this not been familiar with what's going on in the dark web, now if you see it, now I'm sure you can probably think of a lot of scenarios in your organization where just being able to see this and know that it's going on in your environment might be of a great concern to you. So think about what data you have. Would it be valuable to someone? Would it be of value to someone if it was bought or sold on the dark web? And if the answer is it would be, and I can't think of an organization that doesn't have some data that is not damaging to them if it was leaked, then now you see the potential for the damage that can incur if that information were bought and sold in a criminal network through the dark web. And the problem with the dark web technology is many endpoint security technologies that are used in most enterprises these days, like antivirus and firewalls, are not going to tell you that this is going on. So you need some level of visibility to know that my employer, or my employee rather, is doing this type of activity, at least on a work computer. So we've talked about some of the things that people do on the dark web. So selling data for money, and there are many examples here: credit card information, other types of financial information, patient healthcare information, anything that can be bought and sold. There's also the whistleblowing aspect. If someone just has a grudge against their boss or their employer, there's always the possibility of this. And wherever you stand on this as a moral or a political issue, I think most organizations would agree that, I'd rather have the opportunity to fix a problem internally before something that we could have fixed earlier gets aired to the public. So there are a lot of pros and cons to this, but at the end of the day, I think most organizations would rather have an opportunity to fix a problem before an employee decided to leak information about this to the world through any channel, really, the dark web or otherwise. We also talked about hiring and facilitating hacking against employers or competitors, purchasing drugs, and even physical attacks. And this one is really kind of near and dear to my heart. We're here in South Florida, where Veriato is located. Just down the street from us is the city of Parkland, where the attack a year ago happened at Stoneman Douglas High School. Now, that was a high school attack that was prevalent in the news, but it really spoke to, it came really close to home for us, and so much so that we actually took as a company a close look at our own safety protocols, and we didn't have an active shooter policy. We added one after that because now we hear about it so much in the news, we've become anesthetized to it. But now that it's so real, we wanted to take action and make sure at least educated our workforce on how to handle an attack if this happens. Well, what does that have to do with the dark web and my network? Well, there was actually a real world situation just earlier this year where a Coast Guard lieutenant, I believe he was a reservist, was actually planning physical attacks on a work computer. He was actually doing research at work on his computer, looking for targets that he was intending to carry out physical acts of violence against. Now, this could have been caught at work, and we typically think of insider threats in the context of what we do at Veriato, typically as a way to prevent data leaks. And often we forget that there's also a physical danger aspect to this as well. What if the person in the cubicle next to us is having a bad situation at home, or is having troubles, or has had a very bad day with his boss, and now he or she is angry enough that they want to take out a physical attack? Now they're going to go online and probably figure out how to do this, because let's hope that most of us don't have these natural tendencies. We might actually need to go online and look up how to actually do what they expect they want to do. Well, this is a sad commentary on the world we live in, but it is nonetheless a real one. And so where physical attacks also fit into this discussion is one that I would advise most organizations at least to take seriously, and to make sure that you have your internal policies and internal discussions geared towards. So one of the biggest issues that I try to talk to organizations about is their compliance concerns. Protecting data is more and more mandated by a variety of legal regulations and industry regulations. And so it's that protection of data where I want to bring this discussion to for a lot of your listeners, because if you are in a financial industry, for example, or a healthcare industry, you have probably multiple data protection regulations that you are subject to. And it's never just a simple single regulation. Sometimes they reference each other, sometimes they're multiple, sometimes they are based on where you're located, not just on your industry. So some examples here are, most people have heard of HIPAA. This regulation has been around for about 20 years, I believe now, covering the healthcare industry and protection of healthcare patient information, among other things. So if you're in the healthcare industry, you're probably subject to HIPAA regulations, and that involves protecting the data that you are entrusted with, that patient data. PCI compliant payment card payment card information for financial organizations. So you're mandated to protect that data. What if that data gets posted to one of these markets? Now you might be in violation, but if you didn't have adequate controls in your environment to see that someone who was entrusted with protecting that data has now purposefully sold it on the dark web. And these regulations often come with penalties, with fines that can be very significant. New York law, Title 23, covers entities operating in the state of New York in the financial and insurance sectors. So if you're in the banking, financial, or insurance sectors, and I really can't think of any major companies that are in those industries that don't operate in the state of New York, you're now also mandated to audit, meaning monitor the authorized access of that financial and protected data that you're entrusted with. So that means that you need to be watching out not just from hackers coming in from the outside, but what are those people that you've given the passwords to that data in order to do the business for your company? What if they mishandle it? There's now provisions encoded in these data protection regulations that tell you if you're going to collect that data, you must also protect it, and that protection includes from people inside your network. And again, the financial penalties can be quite severe. GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation that was passed just 1 year ago in the European Union to protect consumer data. If you are collecting data on European Union citizens as a business, even if you're operating in the United States, you need to be protecting that data because you're mandated under the provisions of GDPR to protect it and then to provide notification if you ever find it's been leaked or breached in any way. And another example is the California Consumer Protection Act, which was also just enacted recently, and it's a very similar provision, similar to GDPR, only it covers California citizens. And the reason is, in the United States here, we don't have a nationwide data protection regulation similar to GDPR, which covers pretty much the entire European Union. But here in the States, states are taking this on a per state basis. So New York has tackled this within the state of New York for certain industries. California has taken on this topic on behalf of California citizens. So again, a lot of data protection regulations that are telling organizations that if you're collecting data, you need to be protecting it. And the dark web is one of many vectors that we at Veriato try to educate on as one that you need to be looking at. And if you don't have a technology that can let you know that your employees in your company who are accessing, even if they have authorized access to sensitive data, if you cannot see what they're doing with it and whether they're breaching it intentionally or otherwise, then you have a big blind spot in your security model, and you might want to consider how to handle that with technology. So what can you do now that we've talked a little bit about the dark web and some of the issues that can be seen on the dark web and what can impact organizations? Well, organizations can try to block dark web access at the gateways. Now here you have to have a great level of technical capabilities if you really want to tackle each of those technologies we talked about. We talked mostly about the Tor network, but as I mentioned earlier on, there are other technologies as well that comprise components of the dark web. It could be any of a number of these highly encrypted, highly anonymized networking technologies. And again, they don't necessarily have to talk to each other to be hidden. And if they can be hidden from the ability for law enforcement to look at it and see what's going on, or from your own organization, from your enterprise, if they can't see what's going on, then it's a big blind spot. So one way to solve that would be to be on the endpoint where you can see all the activities that are going on every endpoint of those trusted individuals, so that you can see and get the visibility that you probably can't see at the network level, at those gateways, at those firewalls. Some operating systems have user access controls mechanisms that can at least prevent technologies from being installed on those systems without authorization from the administrators. There's one strategy if you really want to harden those endpoints so that an employee cannot simply download, for example, one of these technologies and then use it to anonymously surf through some of these dark web technologies. Security monitoring tools like those which Veriato offers will give some visibility into not just all those activities that the user is using, but also what applications they're using. And so if they're using a Tor browser or the Tor proxy or Freenet or I2C or any of those other technologies we talked about, you can actually see that on the endpoint. And if your technology like ours can also give you the ability to block, then you can alert and block access to .onion sites, for example. So here's another strategy you might want to consider to prevent someone on one of your endpoints from accessing dark web locations and possibly posting sensitive data. And first and foremost, I really love this last point here, is to just encourage a culture of privacy among your employees, both at home, but also enforce strict acceptable use policies at work. If you make it part of the dialogue, educate your workforce, then let them know that these are the expectations, and we may even use a technology to even monitor for these technology uses for these tools. Then you've probably just done yourself a great service. You know, I would rather discourage or deter a breach through a malicious act by having the discussion up front than to wait until one happens and then have to respond to it. So again, one of my favorite talking points for any discussion when it comes to insider threat programs and using a technology to monitor employee activity is to have the discussion up front with them and tell them what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and to make them part of that security solution. So quickly, just a little bit about Veriato. We have been providing insider threat technologies for 20 years. We are in over 100 countries. Over 3,000 enterprises are using our technologies on the endpoints in their organizations to monitor for that the activities of their employees to make sure that those employees are handling sensitive data correctly and not breaching it or not contributing to any type of breach. We're used in 6 out of 10 major technology companies, 7 out of 10 of the largest financial organizations, and 8 out of 10 of the largest healthcare organizations. Some let us talk about them publicly. Some, part of their operations security policy, don't comment on any technologies they use, and I respect that, and I don't want to ever talk about a customer unless they've given us permission to do so. And I've been in the cybersecurity industry for 20 years, and it's pretty common. But a few that do let us talk about it, and you can see here some large names. This is an area of security that has been overlooked for much of the life of the online financial era. The last 20, 30 years or so, as the internet has grown, so too has the ability of the people that we trust on the endpoints to actually have accidents or deliberately damage companies. And we typically think of our security model of including traditional security technologies like antivirus and firewalls. But they didn't do anything to really monitor what was going on inside the network once you've actually given people the passwords and all the keys to the security technology or to the sensitive data that the organization handles. So that's where we fill that hole. Is we are an insider threat protection company. We provide technologies to give that visibility and to give some controls to prevent breaches by individuals on the inside. And Tom, with that, I'd like to hand it over to you if you have any questions.
Oh, beautiful, Patrick. Excellent presentation, very engaging, and great ideas you brought up here for the audience. As we mentioned up front, we do have the opportunity to ask questions, and if folks have not submitted their questions yet, now's the time to do it via the chat window on the screen. I'm sure we don't have time to get to every question, but for those that we can answer today in the course of this session, we will respond to those via email. So Patrick, first question I have here, do people really try to access the dark web at work?
You would think that would be counterintuitive. If someone really intended to do something, their research or any other activities in a malicious way, they probably wouldn't do it where they think they're being watched. But as I mentioned earlier, there are recent headlines that show that this is not always the case. Again, the Coast Guard lieutenant who was actually planning out physical acts of violence at work tells you that while you think this wouldn't have been the smartest decision, he was actually caught using because his organization was using an insider threat technology, and it was alerting on some of the searches he was doing, which were probably pointing to some sort of physical act of violence. Nonetheless, it was suspicious behavior. And so while you think that people wouldn't, the reality is that it is a security hole that if organizations aren't considering it, then they could think of what they could be missing if they're not monitoring for these types of activities. So yeah, it was one of those kind of questions that I had as well. Who on earth would do this? But the reality is, it only takes one, and then then you can have the next Equifax size breach, because it only takes one breach to impact millions of users now within this era of massive data collection, where you don't have to be a massive company to amass gigabytes and millions of records of sensitive data on individuals. You can be actually very small, but you're entrusted with all this data and you must protect it. And so as counterintuitive as it may have been, yes, it could happen, and you don't want this to be a black hole to your security model.
So Patrick, follow-up question, aside from the obvious, to commit crime, what would trigger a person to want to use the dark web versus the surface or clear web?
Mm-hmm. That's a great idea. I think a great question. The part of this is the mystique of it. I think it's attractive when people hear about it, they get curious and want to know more. And that's why I want to take this head on, which is education, because when it's a taboo topic, then I think people will get more interested in it. And it does have a lot of negative press these days. I think you're never hearing about it unless there's been a crime going on. So I think if people are in the back of their minds, whether they ordinarily would commit a bad act of any kind or not, they've heard of it, and now something has happened in their life again, possibly a bad relationship with their boss, a bad review, or maybe personal issues, and now for some reason something has changed. And this happens all the time. We see where good people are hired. We're not always wired to do something bad, but something does change, and sometimes good people will do something bad at some point. And so the question is, now I'm really frustrated, I'm really angry, what do I do? I remember hearing about that dark web thing. Well, they may just jump into it and try to do some online searches. And to partially answer your question, I like to talk about how do people figure out how to get there. Well, they get there typically starting from the surface web. They start searching for dark web. Maybe they start searching for anonymous browsing or Tor browser because they've heard of this, and then quickly they're on that, but then they don't know where to go, so they're probably searching on the clear web for websites on the dark web to navigate to, because remember, again, there's no Google for the dark web, but there are sites that do try to collect limited amounts of URLs to try to point people. So if you're looking for dark web drug sites so you can purchase drugs, you're probably going to start on the clear web, search for that, find your .onion site, for example, download your Tor browser and navigate there. Or where to sell stolen credit card information on the dark web. And so again, these activities are typically going to start on the clear web until you're fluent with the dark web. And once you've built up your own probably personal collection of websites on the dark web, you're probably going to start first on that clear web. So those are some of the initial signs that you can see something's going on. No one knows immediately how to just jump right into this without having done some research first. So it's those research steps that I think are going to be part of the leading indicators. And other leading indicators are that I think I would always advise organizations to be paying attention to aren't even at your computer. They're at, are you seeing how your employees are behaving? Have their attitudes changed? Are they no longer talkative like they used to be? Is something going on possibly in their personal life? Those types of leading indicators as well could tell you something's going up. It may not always be that they're going to perform a malicious act, but wouldn't you rather have caught that malicious act up front before it turns malicious? You know, I prefer to deter any type of breach or malicious act than to do an after action report on one. So hopefully there's some ideas on how people end up on the dark web and some of the reasons why people try to do so.
Patrick, I likely have some follow-up for you as some questions come in, but the question I've got for you right now, how difficult is it for law enforcement or other agencies to investigate dark web activities? I've got to assume there's an awareness challenge there as well.
Well, therein is the key, because that is why a lot of criminal activity is going on there more now than on the surface web, or at least it's moving that way. I can't tell you the volumes, but if I was a criminal wanted to do online activity and avoid the peering eyes of law enforcement, I'm going to choose the dark web. Why? Because it's anonymous. It is invisible. Because of the layers of encryption, law enforcement typically has a very hard time with this. Now, I came out of the intelligence community before I started my civilian cybersecurity career. And so I can't talk about tactics and techniques, and that was so long ago anyway, I wouldn't be able to talk about it because this predates the modern dark web era that we're in now. But I can say, based on headlines I've seen in recent years, that it seems that these highly encrypted technologies are making it more and more impossible for law enforcement to be able to break. Former FBI Director James Comey was testifying a couple years ago about the capabilities of the US FBI with regard to mobile devices, and the fact that encryption is ubiquitous and it's making their jobs harder and harder. So I think he said a statistic like 50% of mobile devices that they capture as part of an investigation, they cannot look into because they're so highly encrypted, they don't have the capabilities of breaking that encryption. Well, you take that concept and apply it to your internet traffic today, and that's where law enforcement is. They don't have the ability. The way that the Silk Road came down, which you mentioned in your intro, was not through hacking the website. From my understanding and reading the analysis of how that was taken down, traditional law enforcement sleuthing connected some telltale evidence that they may have found with evidence they found on the clear web, with the physical address of some of the people running this, and then they were able to perform a setup where I think they caught them red-handed with something, but they had to work out away from the dark web because they couldn't get to the website because they couldn't trace it through the features of the dark web technology of all this encryption and anonymity. So they were actually doing sort of traditional policing in order to get around that, and it made their jobs a lot harder, of course. And you're hearing very few dark web websites being taken down as a result of this. The latest headline I saw was probably one of the most prominent markets that is trading right now on the dark web. I believe it's Empire Market. That's one of these websites like what I showed during the presentation here, where you can buy and sell drugs, weapons, data. They were under a denial of service attack, which was a very interesting thing to hear about on the dark web. Not that law enforcement was taking them down, because obviously they can't find who's hosting this because of that anonymity again, but someone was able to at least use technology and try to shut them down through a denial of service. Well, then they countered with randomizing multiple new sites on the dark web, so that if one is being targeted with a denial of service today, then they just shift over to another one, and that information was again being provided back on that surface web, on the clear web, not necessarily on the dark web. So that was how they were able to stay alive, at least last I read. So some interesting commentaries on where we are with law enforcement's capabilities now, and that deep level of encryption and anonymity we're seeing with the dark web.
Patrick, I got a follow-up for you on the workplace. And the question is, why would any company, any industry, be particularly concerned with employees accessing the dark web?
Sure. So I ask every organization that I talk to, what data do you have that if it walked out the door would cause you serious damage? And the problem with breaches is that we typically don't know the breaches happen today. And there's a study that we cite that the response time between when a breach actually happens and when the organization actually knows is typically on the scale of 6 to 9 months. So if you have data that's sensitive that you're entrusted with, it could be your proprietary information, or it could be healthcare information, or it could be financial information. Whatever's important to your organization, whether you're mandated to protect it or not, if it walked out the door, either physically on a thumb drive or through someone posting it with anonymity and and hidden from the eyes of law enforcement, then that's what you want to protect. And that's why organizations need to be mindful of this risk to them. You know, I'm a security guy. I want to walk through your organization and point out every vulnerability in your company, because you need to be aware of where your weak spots are. We think that if we've got antivirus and a firewall and maybe a backup server for your files, then you're covered. And my job is to say, okay, you've covered those bases, but have you thought about these other areas? And that's what this is about. It's about pointing out that if you've got data that's sensitive and you don't want it sold on the black market or worse, then you might want to add a little visibility to being able to see whether the dark web is being accessed in your organization and block it if possible.
Patrick, one last question. It comes back to characteristics you were talking about before. Now, similar to malicious insiders, one doesn't simply decide one day they're going to transact on the dark web. What are some leading indicators organizations can look out for before actions start to get out of hand?
Sure. Well, I'm a big fan of the human factor, which means, are you talking to your employees and knowing them, and can you tell, you know, by talking to them, can you tell that Patrick today is acting differently than before? Usually that's going to be your first indicator, is just how are they behaving? Have you talked to them? Are they okay at home? And that's the type of positive sort of relationship that we want to encourage with any employer-employee relationship. But as far as online, now you start talking into the types of behaviors that technology can help with more readily, and that's the ability to monitor for not just whether an employee is accessing a dark website today. How about whether their online activities have changed recently? And that's another aspect of the technologies that Veriato offers, is we have a machine learning aspect to our behavior monitoring, which looks for not just what am I doing right now, and is that a problem, like am I accessing the dark web right now, but have my online behaviors actually changed in a way over time that are suggesting that there's a sentiment change or a productivity change or anything that signifies a change in my online activities. Maybe I'm sending more data through email and in the form of attachments. Does that mean I'm possibly sending too much data out of the enterprise that I shouldn't be? Or am I all of a sudden uploading files to a cloud share? Or maybe I'm typically sending 30 emails a day and now I'm sending 2. These are telltale signs that technology can help you with to give some visibility to saying, Patrick's behaviors have changed here and they seem to have slowed down. And that could be a sign of a lot of things, personal depression, anger, and so forth. And it's not always necessarily bad, but it's an indicator that maybe if HR stepped in and said, Patrick, are things going okay? Well, I'm having problems at home, and well, I'm sorry to hear that. Maybe you want to use some of the counseling options that we have with our healthcare benefits or something. Try to proactively be a part of the solution rather than wait until something bad has happened. Again, not necessarily all changes in attitudes and behaviors are going to result in something bad, but those are typically the first signs that something will go bad when it does. Typically the person doesn't walk through the doors happy and cheerful as always and then does something really malicious. It's usually their behaviors change first, and you can see that both on the physical level and at the technology level. So again, we try to offer technologies that can help pinpoint that, and that's going to help organizations that need to scale as well, because you may not see all 500 employees on every given day, but the technology will. The technology is going to tell you something is different, something has changed, and maybe you want to go have a discussion or dig deeper. And so there's the way we try to help solve that problem.
Very well. Patrick, I appreciate your time and insight today, and especially the time you took to answer these questions so thoughtfully. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Tom.
Of course, I want to thank our attendees as well. You took time out of your day to attend this session, and we're grateful. I do trust that today's discussion provided valuable new insight to enable you and your organization to be even better prepared to tackle these dark web issues we've discussed here today. I look forward to seeing you again at one of our upcoming sessions. Until then, for Information Security Media Group, I'm Tom Field. Thank you very much.